So I first want to give some kudos to Dr. Chris Morris. I saw his presentation on advocacy and it was excellent. And you guys were very lucky to have that. I actually learned a couple things from that. But I'm very pleased to chat with you a little bit about the billion-dollar business that sits between us and our patients. So there are a number of multi-billion-dollar companies in the drug supply chain, and I'll show you exactly what the drug supply chain is. We all know about pharmaceutical manufacturers, and we all know about drug pricing and how prices have skyrocketed, and just a couple of really sort of egregious behaviors. We'll start with the manufacturers, but that's not what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking a little bit more about those entities that were not really that transparent and were not really that sure of what they do. Now, I put this up here because I'm from Louisiana, and I don't know how many of you in the audience are from Louisiana, but you might know what this is. This is a nutria. And the reason why I put it up there, I was doing a little bit of research on some of the egregious behaviors of manufacturers, and this picture came up. And I just thought there was such a close analogy between the two that I had to share my state animal. Now, who is this man? His name is Martin Shkreli, and he's best known for some of his outrageous drug pricing when he took over as CEO of Turing Pharmaceuticals. And he essentially increased the price of Daraprim, which is an anti-infective used for AIDS patients, from $1,700 a bottle to $75,000 a bottle. And he looked at it as a very handsome investment. And probably one of the other things that, you know, I guess I can hold this against him, but he also spent $2 million on a one-of-a-kind Wu-Tang Clan album. This is an example of egregious behavior by pharmaceutical manufacturers. There's a lot more that I could highlight. The drugs that I use in rheumatology have gone from $500 a month up to $10,000 a month, with really virtually no change in the medication or the way they're manufactured. So prices are definitely skyrocketing. But I think there's a few other forces at play, and that's probably what we're going to talk about today, is some of the incentives behind having higher priced drugs and who makes money on those. So let's back up a little bit and talk, what is access to medication? People talk about access and affordability, but I actually look at access as both the availability of the medicine, which of course, first off, has it been discovered? Have they gone through all of the studies? Has the FDA approved it for use? And then of course, has it been launched? Has it been brought to market? And once it's brought to market, the big question is, if it's expensive, is it on the formulary? And I'll explain what a formulary is, just very basics. Most of you probably know what it is, but we'll go through a few definitions. And then, if it's available, is it affordable? Meaning, is your cost share for that medication something that you can afford? Can you pay for it? So availability and affordability, in my mind, are what determine access. For the most part, we're going to be talking about expensive medicines. So let's look at a couple of definitions. Formulary essentially is the list of medications that insurance will pay for. There are various tiers, so different levels. Generally, the lowest tier is the one that is the cheapest. I'd like to think it's the lowest priced, but not necessarily. They usually are generics. And as you go higher and higher, the cost share for patients goes up and up. And finally, you get to fourth tiers and specialty drugs. And those are the hardest to get to. Preferred drugs are the ones that the health plans would like patients to use. And you have to use those first before you can get to any other drugs. You have to, that's what's known as step therapy. You have to step through the preferred drugs first. Specialty drugs, really just another name for specialty drugs, are expensive medications. I mean, I remember back in the early 90s when a small molecule drug came out for rheumatoid arthritis called, the brand name was Areva, and it was $400 a month, and our jaws dropped and went, oh my God, how are patients ever going to afford $400 a month? I mean, that's really a cheap drug these days. So copay and coinsurance are basically the way the patient cost share. A copay is a fixed amount. You go to the drugstore to pick up your medication, and you may have a $10 copay, $25 copay, $100 copay, regardless of what the drug is. Always remember, though, and I remember to tell patients, always check GoodRx or another type of plan that sometimes discounts the drug, because oftentimes patients can get the drug for less than what their copay is. Coinsurance is generally what the patient's cost share for these very expensive medicines. It's not a fixed price. It's actually a percentage of the list price of the drug. So there's a big distinction between copay and coinsurance, and that can make a difference as to whether the patient can afford the drug or not. So because the formulary is so important, who really constructs the formulary? It's a group of companies called pharmacy benefit managers. And I think I first heard the term pharmacy benefit managers probably in the 90s, the late 90s. There was a company called Medco, and Merck, a pharmaceutical company, owned it, Merck Medco, and Federal Trade Commission came along and said, you can't make the drug and then determine the formulary. So they no longer would let a manufacturer own something called a pharmacy benefit manager. We call them PBMs. And again, it really has only been in the last maybe 8 to 10 years that I've become interested in PBMs. And I'm interested in a lot of things with advocacy. So if you've never heard of them or really don't care about them, I wouldn't blame you. But they actually construct the formulary. Now, what maintains the formulary? What keeps the formulary year after year how the PBM wants it to be? And those are called utilization management tools. That's another phrase that's, a lot of words that kind of don't make sense. And I'll explain tools in a couple of slides from now. But PBMs make the formulary, utilization management tools maintain the formulary. So if we step back a little bit and look at some of the major players in the drug distribution system. Now, I'm talking about the drugs that are on the pharmacy side, the kind that you go to the drugstore to pick up or you get through mail order, not the kind that are infused in the hospital or infused in a patient's office or given by the provider. So we've got the drug makers, the insurance companies, the pharmacy benefit managers, and I've kind of put the prescribers and the patients sort of on the side like crumpled up paper bags, in the trash. Because believe it or not, the prescriber and the patient are small potatoes when it comes to the drug distribution system. I would suggest that prescriptions now are mere suggestions. We suggest what we would like our patient to have as a medication, and then the other powers that be decide if that's okay or whether they agree with that suggestion. It really has come down to that in some cases. So what do they really do? They're companies, they probably came into being more like in the 1970s to set up a list of drugs that Medicaid would cover. And as prescription drugs became more and more expensive, health insurance companies, which are used to covering payment for hospitals and seeing the doctor, all of a sudden had to start figuring out ways to pay for all of these drugs. So they decide to hire companies called pharmacy benefit managers who would do things like adjudicate pharmacy claims. Yeah, the word adjudicate is like, well, what does that mean? Well, basically they handle how the medicine gets paid for, how it gets covered. They also determine what the cost share is, whether it's going to be a copay or a coinsurance. PBMs also decide what pharmacies you can go to. They create the pharmacy network. And then, of course, as I said, they construct and maintain the formulary. So they are pretty powerful when it comes to our drug supply chain. So who are they? I'm sure most of you have heard of Express Scripts, CVS Caremark, OptumRx. These big three pretty much control nearly 80% of the PBM market share in the country. And as you can see, They are little money-making machines. All three have been in the top 25 of the Fortune 500 for years. The last time they were actually independent, so Express Scripts was an independent pharmacy benefit manager. CVS Caremark was part of CVS Health, but mark my words, it wasn't the pharmacy that was pulling in all the money. It was the PBM, CVS Caremark. And then OptumRx has been a part of a larger insurance company, United Healthcare, since its origin. United Healthcare years ago bought a PBM called Catalyst, and it has turned into OptumRx. So we had two independent PBMs until about a year and a half ago, when, because they make so much money, everybody wanted to own one. So Cigna bought Express Scripts, and CVS Caremark, because it makes so much money, was able to cobble together $68 billion to buy Aetna. Now, that was the most troublesome one for the Department of Justice. It took them about a year, but they finally said, oh, it's okay, fine. Federal Trade Commission had no problem with this sort of conglomeration of health plans and PBMs. And then you see United Healthcare was already integrated with OptumRx. So Humana, Blue Cross Blue Shield, and as you know, if you're in Alabama, Blue Cross Blue Shield rules. They are players in this, but the big three are those first three. And then you'll also notice they own what are known as specialty pharmacies. Express Scripts had Accredo, Caremark had its specialty pharmacy, and OptumRx owns Briova. And that becomes very important as well in terms of anti-competitive behavior, because specialty pharmacies make a lot of money in dispensing those specialty drugs. So now we've got, the triumvirate of which basically monopolize the market. So are there, I don't mean to cast PBMs in a terrible light for all of them. There are some transparent fee-based PBMs, but they're small, and the insurance brokers don't refer to them because the brokers can't make as much money when they refer to the small PBMs. But in general, PBMs claim to save billions of dollars for our healthcare system. And you'll see this, the PCMA, which is the trade group for PBMs, advertises this everywhere. They even have, ads on television, how much money PBMs save. And they do this, they say, through creating formularies based on negotiated discounts. I'll hope by the end of this presentation, you'll realize that these negotiated discounts are nothing more than secret kickback packages from manufacturers based on the list price and the market share. PBMs use these utilization management tools because they claim that they save money and that employers want them. But what they do is keep patients on the most profitable drugs, and you'll see how that works. And most employers have no idea what they're signing. I give sort of a, I don't want to say dumbed down, but a little bit dumbed down talk on PBMs to employers so that they understand, what they're signing. And I can't tell you how many come up to me afterwards and said, we had no idea. We would have never wanted to sign up for a plan that one of the employers had atrial fibrillation and her drug was just taken off of the formulary. She said, I would have never signed up for a plan that took the only drug that put me in sinus rhythm off of the formulary. They also claim to have more affordable pharmacy channels. I'm going to let the pharmacists fight that fight, and they do really well. PBMs are not kind to, certainly not to independent pharmacists. And then, of course, PBMs claim to save all these billions by encouraging lower priced drugs, not so much brand drugs. Well, that's not necessarily the case. They often will choose higher priced drugs. In 2019, I testified before Congress, Energy and Commerce, and I made the statement that PBMs put higher priced drugs on their formulary, sometimes choosing higher priced over lower priced drugs. And the chairman of the committee looked at the woman who was there representing PBMs and said, is this true? And they went back and forth. And finally, she said, yes, we do choose higher priced drugs, but we do that because they cost less. going to let that sink in a little bit, and you'll see what they mean by that. But it's cost less for whom? Okay, so I'm going to backtrack again and just tell you a little bit about utilization management tools, the things that sort of keep the formulary in place how the PBMs want them. As the title suggests, they are tools that allow the PBM to manage the utilization of drugs. Prior authorization is the bane of many private practice physicians. There's 3 of us in my group, rheumatologists, and we have a full-time, actually a 1.5 time person just doing prior authorizations, basically begging the PBM to allow us to use a drug and letting them know all of our thought processes, why we think the patient needs that drug. And then they will deign to decide whether the patient can have it or not. Then there's step therapy, and that's, otherwise known as fail first policy. You have to take these drugs before you can get to the next level drugs. And we make that decision, and I'll tell you what that decision is based on shortly. And then one of my favorites is non-medical switching. There's a patient signs up for a particular health plan because it covers their expensive medicine. And then in the middle of the year, the middle of the plan year, they just either drop the medication altogether or put it on a higher tier so it'll cost the patient a lot more. And that's not right. I mean, they're changing the patient for a reason that has nothing to do with the state of their disease or any kind of medical decision. It's as if a pilot's up in the air and the air traffic controller comes on and says, yeah, I know you were supposed to go to Chicago, but Chicago's no longer on our destination formulary. You're going to have to land in St. Louis, even though Chicago always worked best for the people who wanted to go to Chicago, but St. Louis will do just as well. You can appeal this if you want to hang around in the air for the next 6 weeks, and then we'll let you know if you can land in Chicago. Chicago, St. Louis, they're both cities. What's the difference? That's the approach in non-medical switching when we look at formularies. So if you really think about it, PBMs determine what drugs our patients can take by constructing the formulary, particularly for the expensive drugs, because they can't afford them if they're not on the formulary. When our patients can get these drugs, step therapy tells you the order in which you can take them. They can arbitrarily just be dropped. So when our patients can take drugs, where they can get their drugs, you can't go to any drugstore and pick it up. You have to go to certain drugstores, or you're forced to have mail order. And in some cases, yes, mail order is more convenient. But, if you live in the South and you've got a porch and it's a temperature sensitive drug, yes, it might come to your house in some type of a cooler, but if it sits there for hours, who knows if it's been affected by the heat. And ultimately, how much patients are going to pay. They determine the copay and they determine the coinsurance. So PBMs are pretty important when it comes to our patients' access to drugs. So I'm going to break down this drug money services flow. And on first glance, it's going to look like not quite as complicated as an immunology slide, but it's going to have a lot of arrows and things like that. But we're going to talk about one particular aspect of this. So basically, we are going to hone in on this relationship between the pharmacy benefit manager and the drug manufacturer, because you'll see shortly what happens is the PBM sort of offers a particular placement on the formulary to the manufacturer for a certain amount of rebates and fees, and their kickbacks. And, when I first started calling them kickbacks in op-eds, I was a little concerned about the fact that I was calling them kickbacks. But my son, who's an attorney, said, Mom, you can call them kickbacks because they have safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute. And if they weren't kickbacks, they wouldn't need the safe harbor. So I feel pretty comfortable calling them kickbacks. So initially, so there's really no one looking over the PBM's shoulder. It used to be that health plans, as you can see here, the health plans didn't know anything about these rebates. They do now. About 4 years ago, Anthem sued Express Scripts because they found out about all these rebates that PBMs were getting from the manufacturer that they weren't passing back to Anthem. So they sued them and then they fired them. But as you recall, pretty much most health plans either own their own PBM or they are owned by a PBM. So now the money goes into a bigger black box. And there really is no transparency to understand what happens to that money, how much of that money is given back by the manufacturer, how much are fees, how much are rebates. And it's become a very opaque, deep black box. So if you think about it, if you make an expensive drug, no matter how great it is, if it's not on the formulary, no one's going to take it. No one will be able to afford it. So the key for a manufacturer is to get on the formulary. But maybe what's even more important than being on the formulary is being on the preferred formulary. And this is why. This is why they fight for preferred placement. So, because of step therapy, if you're on preferred placement, patients have to fail your drug first. Because of non-medical switching, the PBMs can just switch all the patients over to your drug. And it can exclude competitors to your drug. So manufacturers really want to be on preferred placement, and they fight for it. And how do they fight for it? Well, let's see what determines preferred placement. Is it the efficacy of the drug? How about the safety? Well, you're not going to find drugs on the formulary that aren't efficacious and aren't safe. But are those the main attributes that determine what preferred placement is? Well, we keep talking about savings, so maybe it's the lowest list price. Nope, guess again. It's the rebate story, and we can't forget about the fees. So I'm going to try to take this slowly because we hear a lot about rebates, but I think you'll see it becomes quite clear that the profitability of a drug for the middlemen is essentially what determines what goes on to the preferred placement. So there's a bidding war among the drug makers to get the preferred spot on the formulary, and we now know why. Because it grants them market share. They've got control. They get an increase in terms of the number of patients who utilize their medication. And physicians are forced to use those drugs first. So this is my attempt at PowerPoint art. Basically, we have all of the manufacturers sending secret kickback packages to the pharmacy benefit manager, and they are going to determine which one gets the prize spot. The golden ring. So what's a rebate? Years ago, rebates, I first heard about rebates, I guess, with computers. You'd go into Best Buy and buy a printer, and you'd send in your receipt, and they would send you back $25. That was a long time ago. But it's the same kind of thing. The PBM will pay for a script, and as soon as the script is written and paid for, the manufacturer sends them back a very large chunk of money, consequently bringing down the cost of the medicine for the PBM only. So for each script that's filled, they send back money plus fees based on the list price of the drug in exchange for preferred placement on the formulary. So how do you figure out the rebate? Well, the rebate is essentially the list price times the percent promised times the scripts filled. Now, the scripts filled is the market share because a rebate is sent back for every script that is filled. So the more number of, the higher number of scripts that are filled, the more rebates the PBM gets. But if you think about it, market share is kind of determined by who's on preferred. So you may have a market share, but if your rebate percentage and list price isn't high enough, they could very well just switch everyone over and grant a different drug the market share. So it really comes down to the list price of the drug and the percent rebated. And as we all know from simple algebra, If you increase any one of these variables, your chance at getting preferred placement go up because your total formulary rebate goes up. So let's look at an example. Which drug has the best bid? So we have drug A, B, and C that are indicated for disease X. The list price of drug A is $2,000 a month, and they are offering the PBM a 60% rebate. So every time a script is filled, they're going to give them back $1,200. So essentially, drug A costs the PBM $800, but they get $1,200. Drug B is $4,000 a month, and they're offering a 40% rebate, which is $1,600 in rebate. And then drug C is $5,000 a month, and again, they're only offering a 40% kickback, which is $2,000. So which one has the best bid? Not which drug ends up costing the most, but which has the best bid. If you guessed drug C, you are absolutely correct. $2,000 go back to the PBM. And they call those savings. Let's put it another way. PBMs claim they save billions of dollars through their preferred formularies. Let's use an example of calculating savings the PBM way. I'm going to use an example of dresses. I gave a presentation before the Iowa, one of their state senates, and I used the price of bulls. But today we're going to use dresses. So one dress, there are two dresses pretty much exactly the same. One is priced at $1,000. The other dress is priced at $100. And both are offered at 50% off the list price. Which dress would PBMs pick for their dress formulary? If you guessed the $1,000 dress, you're absolutely correct, because no one really knows what the prices are. All they know are about the savings. And the PBM said, I just saved you $500 on the dress. Granted, it'll cost you $500, but you're feeling great because it saved you $500. They don't want to pick the $100 dress because you only get a savings of $50. They fail to tell you, however, that dress would have only cost you $50. So that's how PBMs define savings. So they came out a year or so ago and said, if we could only use more utilization management tools over the next 10 years, we could generate $1 trillion in savings. I would submit we can't afford $1 trillion in savings, not the way PBMs define savings. Okay, let's talk a little bit about competition. Everyone, the PBMs say we can't have transparency about all these ways that we put formularies together, about what rebates are, what fees are, because transparency will soften competition and raise prices. So yes, we do know in many cases competition lowers prices, and without competition, prices go up. But let's look at actually how competition can affect prices. It's not always lowering prices. So I have two examples here. One is when you're building a house. If you're building a house and everything's the same, none of the contractors are your brother-in-law, your sister's cousin's best friend, the quality is the same. The more contractors bidding, they try to undercut each other. So yes, in this case, competition brings the price down and you're more apt to choose, all things being equal, the lowest price. However, what if you're selling your house? If you've ever bought a house and there is that one house that everyone wants, they'll put one day where all the bids go in for the house. And everybody puts in their highest bid because they know the seller is going to pick the one that's going to pay them the most. So in the case of building a house, competition drives the prices down. But what happens when you're selling the house? Competition actually drives the price up. Which one do you think our drug distribution system, what competition does to get on the formulary? Yes, there is a perverse incentive for higher priced drugs. Not lower, because the higher priced medicine provides the larger rebate fee package for the entity creating the formulary. Not only do the rebates go up, but the admin fees go up, the price protection rebate goes up. A formulary rebate could be $1,000, an admin fee could be $20,000. Price protection fees go into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. If the manufacturer raises their price during a contract year, the PBM makes even more money. Specialty pharmacy fees go up, vendor fees go up, everything goes up. Everyone makes more money when the drugs are priced higher in the drug distribution chain. Some of the sort of the non-price consequences of this formulary construction, it actually infringes on the doctor-patient relationship. Step therapy determines what drugs we can prescribe first. Non-medical switching, I've testified before other state legislatures where we had patients come in. Patient stories make so much difference. Saying this was a young girl, and this was just basically on seizure medication. And they dropped her seizure medicine from the extended release to the non-extended release, and she couldn't afford the extended release anymore. They had dropped it from the formulary. So she was forced to take more pills during the day, started having seizures, missed her graduation, and couldn't start college on time from non-medical switching. And then, of course, the formulary construction excludes drugs that don't, offer a big enough rebate. It incentivizes higher list prices. I would submit it also stifles innovation. Biosimilars, new medications. There's a certain mechanism of action of drugs that treat rheumatoid arthritis called JAK inhibitors, and there's 3 on the market. One costs $28,000 a year, one costs around $55,000, and one costs $65,000. Guess which one has most of the penetrance on the formulary? The $65,000 a year drug. It also increases the patient cost sharing, and that's for commercial and Medicare. You just saw this slide with what happens with higher list prices, but probably what's most important, the patient cost share goes up because the co-insurance is based on the list price. So if the list price is $10,000 a month, and PBMs save $8,000, meaning they only pay $2,000. Guess which price the patients pay their coinsurance on? They pay it on the $10,000 a month. So consequently, their cost share every month is $2,000 every single month. Coinsurance is based on the list price. Patients can't afford that. They've already tried the generic drugs, the lower cost alternatives, and now they're faced with even $200 a month. But when you look at these specialty drugs that are thousands of dollars a month, the patients just have no access to them. So what happened was manufacturers started making copay cards that would pay for their cost share. It wasn't because they were trying to avoid lower priced drugs, because the patients had already tried those. The other way these copay cards helped patients was because patients with chronic illnesses spend a lot of money on healthcare. So I don't know if you understand the concept of deductible, but that's how much money you have to spend before your insurance kicks in. So in order to pay a lower premium, particularly patients with chronic illnesses are picking plans that have a very high deductible so they can afford the premium. The deductible may be $10,000. So patients have to pay $10,000 before their insurance even kicks in. So if you've got $2,000 a month in copays, you have to do 5 of those before you've even met your deductible. But the good news was the manufacturer copay cards, because it was money going into the PBM and the insurance company, it counted towards the deductible. So it also helped patients by reducing their deductible. But PBMs thought, well, wait just a minute. So patients are not paying their full deductible. We're getting that $10,000, but the patients aren't paying it. We need to figure out a way that we can get the manufacturer's money and the patient's money. How can we do that? Let's figure out a way that those copay cards don't count towards the deductible. And that's exactly what they did. And about 3 to 4 years ago, they started implementing something called an accumulator adjustment program. The reason why I'm telling you this is because I want you to take action on legislation that bans these kinds of programs. It essentially disallows any money that doesn't come out of the patient's own pocket. And yes, health insurance companies had the nerve to send letters, and my patient got one. Unless the money comes out of your own pocket, it won't count towards your deductible. Essentially, the health plans are deductible double dipping. They want the money from the patient and they want the money from the manufacturer. Sometimes the deductible gets paid double, sometimes even more. They justify it by saying copay cards are bad. They entice patients to take higher priced drugs. Well, I can tell you, my patients with rheumatoid arthritis would be happy if they didn't need these specialty drugs. But they do. They've used the lower cost alternatives, and this is the only way they can afford them. So if we really look at it, how often are copay cards actually used when there's a lower priced generic or a lower priced alternative? 0.4% of the time. So that justification for using accumulators and the whole argument of enticing patients to use higher priced drugs falls quite short when you actually look at the data. So how do they get away with all of this, with the kickbacks and creating formularies that give them more money? They get away with it because what I sort of alluded to earlier was they have safe harbor from the anti-kickback statute. There's a statute that, makes it so that physicians can't, take certain kinds of businesses to their cath lab. They can't do things where it appears as though they're getting kickbacks to use certain medications, to use a certain particular laboratory. Most people in the healthcare system can't take kickbacks. However, PBMs and health insurance plans can. They have safe harbor from it. So who regulates these PBMs? Where do they, how do they why aren't they regulated more? So we have two ways that they can be regulated. They can be regulated through legislation, through laws, or regulatory agencies. And we've got those both on the federal level and the state level. Health and Human Services, or Medicare, they've tried to do something, and actually the last administration has put through what we call the rebate rule, where all these rebates have to go to the patient at the point of sale. Of course, the PBMs have already sued and said, no, premiums are going to go up. Who raises the premiums? The PBMs, who are already multi-billion-dollar companies. You take a little bit of money away from them and they raise premiums. Federal Trade Commission, I'm sorry, they have never met a PBM they didn't love. They actually buy the saying that transparency softens competition and raises prices. Oh, well, we can't ask them to show their trade secrets. Prices will go up. Yeah, well, how's that working for you? Department of Justice, I think they tried to stop one of the mergers, but the pressure was just too great. Congress, there is a Safe Step Act, a step therapy bill that's winding its way through Congress now. And I would, ask anyone who has the opportunity to support that with their senators and House of Representatives to do that. The problem is that the health insurance, the health plans, and the PBMs in particular, along with the manufacturers, are quite powerful. Insurance plans gave $10 million to Biden and $10 million to Trump. They know how to play the game really well. So then if the feds aren't going to do anything, it's sort of left up to the states. And I'll tell you, state legislation has been working. CSRO, the Coalition of State Rheumatology Organizations, we're sort of the leading gurus. We've got model language for step therapy bills, allowing patients to step over step therapy. We've got model language for accumulator bans. And so I'm going to show you a real quick way, just from sitting in front of your computer, how you can actually help. Board of Pharmacy, insurance commissioners, particularly in those states where they're elected. Let's take Louisiana. The last 3 insurance commissioners went to jail. If they're elected, guess who gives them the most money for their campaigns? Yes, insurance companies and attorney general. So very quickly, this is the legislative map tool. Go to csro.info/map. Find your state. Click on that state. You can see the green means there's active legislation for usually a new step therapy bill, stopping accumulator programs. And if it's green, there's active legislation. Blue, it's been passed. Louisiana, let's click on Louisiana. And yes, we have an accumulator ban that is before the Senate Committee on Insurance right now. You can see all of the enacted legislation. We had a great step therapy bill passed last year that would enable stable patients to stay on their medication and have them paid for as long as the drug just got moved to a higher tier. I have a patient that's an ophthalmologist who we were just chatting about this, and he has used Louisiana's step therapy bill and has kept 2 patients on one of their medications that they wanted to make the patient pay more. But let's look at the accumulator ban and pick whatever state you're in and see if you've got legislation. If you're in Louisiana, you can read the bill. This is basically, sometimes it's an abbreviated form. This just tells us where it is. This accumulator ban not allowing insurance companies, they must allow the copay cards to count towards the deductible. And how do you take action? So you can use our letter, but it's always better to write your own. So if you fill out that right side here, compose your letter, put in your name and address, it'll automatically be sent to your state House of Representatives or state senator, and show your support for banning accumulators. There's about 22 states that have accumulator ban pieces of legislation out there, and use the CSRO map tool. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to pay anything. You can just send the message, so you can become an advocate very, very simply. So I hope you can see that the pharmacy benefit market fails on a number of issues. Certainly accountability. I have no idea who they're accountable to at this point in time. Conflict of interest. When you can create a formulary utilizing drugs that make you the most money, I would consider that a conflict of interest. Fiduciary responsibility. Express Scripts has already said their only fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders. And finally, transparency. I forgot I put this in here. If you're interested, I wrote a little piece called Formulary Construction in America, Perfectly Legal and Perfectly Wrong. Put my name in, put Helio, which is the media piece where it was published, and you can read it. It's a pretty simple read. And I think of them all sitting around their board of directors table. Let's never forget that the public's desire for transparency has to be balanced by our need for concealment. And I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. And thank you.